A little bit about what we're up to in the coming months, but I want to introduce the Arts Collective for those who are new to us. So we're a supportive group of artists who have lived experience with substance use or mental health challenges. And we get together to connect with each other, share our work, plan events, and put on exhibitions. So we've held these virtual artist talks all last year, and we're resuming the series on a bi-monthly basis this year. Our next talk will be with Robert Waldo Brunel Jr., who is also here right now, in August. So we're really looking forward to that as well. As Kara mentioned, if you want to be added to our mailing list and receive notices of these events and our shows and other activities, you can send your email to me privately in the chat, or you can also email us at artscollective@howardcenter.org. So everyone with the lived experience that I mentioned before is welcome to participate in our activities. And a quick note about the structure of today's talk. There will be plenty of time to ask questions, but we do ask that everyone keeps their questions and comments brief so that we can get to everyone. And now I want to introduce our guest artist, John Killacky. John R. Killacky has served 2 terms in the Vermont House of Representatives. Before that, he was the executive director of Flynn Center for the Performing Arts here in Burlington, program officer for arts and culture at San Francisco Foundation, executive director of Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and curator of performing arts for Walker Art Center. He has also worked with Pew Charitable Trusts, PepsiCo Summer Fair, and the Trisha Brown and Laura Dean dance companies. He's received numerous awards, including but not limited to the Sally Ordway Irvine Award in Artistic Vision, William Dawson Award for Programming Excellence, Dance USA's Ernie Award as an Unsung Hero, and Vermont Arts Council's Kannenstein Award for Arts Advocacy. He co-edited the award-winning anthology Queer Crips, Disabled Gay Men and Their Stories, and is the author of Because Art. So we're really excited to have him with us today. Thank you so much for coming, John, and I'm going to hand it off to you now.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and what a pleasure to be with my friends here, which is very lovely. And I'm going to put a plug in to Robert, because you're going to be hearing from him next month. But you can actually vote for him for the Daisies, okay? And so if you vote for him for the Daisy, we'll be celebrating next month when he wins one. So because he's sort of been Sally Fields, you know, nominated. And so this year we want to show him love. So go to the 7 days, go to the Daisies. And Robert, you're in 2 categories, aren't you?
3, best cartoonist, best painter, and best illustrator.
Okay, so if you haven't voted yet, that would be lovely. You know, it's really a pleasure to be here today and to kind of take the opportunity to think about what does an artist mean to me in my life, the art that I've done in my life, and what kind of role that has played for me. And we're among artists today, and so it's really a nice conversation. I'm going to make some remarks, and I'm going to share some of my work, and we're going to have a video, and then we'll have conversations afterwards. I grew up in Chicago in working class Irish Catholic family. And Irish Catholic means we only went to an Irish Catholic school. We didn't even play with the publics, okay? So it was Irish Catholic. My dad and my grandfathers worked at the Chicago Stockyards. So art wasn't something that was really in our lives, in the fabric of our lives. There were 5 siblings. But my school took me on a school trip to see the Alvin Ailey Dance Company. And I remember coming home that night, I was just in awe. And at the family dinner with the 5 kids and mom and dad, I announced that I was going to be a modern dancer. And like this was the 60s. There was no such thing as a modern dancer, especially in my family. But, you know, my mom got out the yellow pages. And that Saturday drove me downtown. And it changed my life. And, you know, back then, it was a political statement for an effeminate young gay boy to dance and claim that. And so when I think about it, it was sort of my first political act. But I did find community there, which was important. And then at 16, I remember borrowing the car. I just got my license, and I didn't tell my parents where I was going. I think they probably thought I was going to go get a hamburger or something. But it was during the Democratic convention in Chicago. And so I drove down there, and the convention site, of course, was locked down. I just jumped right into the street protests, and the cops beat the crap out of us, but we were all screaming, the whole world is watching. And it was, and so sort of activism was just part of it for me. I was still in high school. I was the editor of the high school newspaper. It came out 6 times, and 6 times I was suspended because the Irish Catholic high school did not like my point of view on things. They didn't censor me, but they suspended me after every edition. It was interesting. But I continued dancing. I was performing in Chicago, and then at the age of 20, I got a scholarship to go study in New York. And so I got a one-way ticket to New York, and the Harkness Ballet was a company that they invited me to come spend the summer with them. And if I was good enough, I would probably be invited, or I'd have the opportunity to be invited to the company. What was amazing is in Chicago, I was probably a fairly good dancer. And in New York, I was a mediocre dancer. And it was clear that I was not going to be a classical ballet dancer unless I was going to be in a small company in the core, way in the back in the corner. But it's 1973 now in New York, so postmodern was happening, and it was all kinds of things. So I fell into lots of other kinds of things, and it also, from a queer perspective, it was a few years after Stonewall, and so kind of a gay and lesbian identity was emerging there. And I was in a play called Coming Out, which I'm told was the first gay history play. Now, I don't know if it's the first, but Jonathan Ed Katz's wonderful play where we each played multiple characters. And what was interesting, during the day I'd be in the classical ballet world, and at night I would be in the gay activist world. And I remember some of my classical friends saying, well, this play, is it politics or is it art? And I thought, well, that's interesting. I'm working really hard as an actor here. I'm trying. So I think it's art, but it's a little political. That fall, I was invited to Winnipeg to be in a company. But I got in trouble the first time because I was interviewed. The local newspaper is one of the new dancers, and I talked about being in the play Coming Out. And the director of the company said, well, John, you really shouldn't talk about being gay. And it's like, well, they asked me what I did, and I was telling them about this play. And so I stayed a year with the company. I had a great time, but I really wanted to be back in New York. So went back to New York. I danced with company Gene Erdman's theater, The Open Eye, and did my own work. Had, 15 part-time jobs usually. And I also went back to college and got my degree in psychology. From there, I was still making art. It was more like contact improvisation and experimental work. I was invited to go on tour with Laura Dean, who was a dance company. And because I had toured as a dancer, she said, well, we need a tour manager. Why don't you come and do this for us? So I did that. And then, as Sarah said, I worked with the Trisha Brown Dance Company. And it was really quite beautiful working with those companies. And at that moment in New York, and kind of the growth of modern dance worldwide. I would say the next wave of political artwork that happened in my life was really in the 80s and 90s, and that was during the AIDS pandemic. As a gay man in New York at that time, it was really astounding to be living through all of our friends dying. And artists were very central to pushing back. There was a group called ACT UP, and they did very theatrical events, protest events. And artists like Keith Haring and a number of artists were very involved in that. So it was really a marvelous time for art to really be almost like the first responders in the AIDS protest movement. In my book that Sarah mentioned, because art, I profile a number of the artists that I knew and I worked with during that time. Keith Haring, Peter Hujar, Douglas Crimp, Sarah Schulman, Donna Ann McAdams, Tim Miller, Bill T. Jones, and Tony Kushner were all artists. And their art was about AIDS activism, and it was part of my world. In '88, I was invited to be the curator at the Walker Art Center. And my job there was to present contemporary artists. And contemporary artists were pretty pissed off at this point in the performing arts, as in the visual arts. And the body was feared. If you think about the AIDS pandemic back then, body fluids, nudity, it was very scary. And because people didn't know what was happening. So of course, artists were reclaiming the body as a political act of survival. And so in 1990, we put a series together called Cultural Infidels. And we had people like Andy Warhol, and then we juxtaposed modern day provocateurs, because, you know, art and politics, they really, to me, were never separate. This wasn't anything new. But we invited a woman named Karen Finley, and she did an incredible piece called We Keep Our Victims Ready. Opening night was sold out. I'm called over to the box office, and these two men say, well, we'd like to see the show. And I said, well, it's sold out. You may have to come back tomorrow. And they said, oh no, we're the Vice Squad. We have to see the show. And this is the museum. And it was like, why are you here? I don't understand. Well, we got a complaint that this woman is a pornographer. They're like, well, Karen Finley's never been here. So how can someone complain about something they haven't seen? Karen's work, she is naked in the work at times. And at one point she talks about the misogyny in the world. And she talks about Valentine's Day. And she takes chocolates and she smears them on her body. And so, you know, it had some notoriety. It's a very powerful cathartic piece because she was, as needed, reclaiming her body as a political act. Now, museums have nudes everywhere. Nude statues, nude paintings. It's like, so I was mystified that someone was afraid that an angry woman being naked was going to be obscene. So anyway, I didn't have a choice. They came in, they sat on the stairs. Midway through, they left, and it was like, but it became a time, especially in the contemporary art world, that artists were demonized, and people like Karen were denied grants. You know, Robert Mapplethorpe's photographs were museums canceled shows because there was nude, sexualized photographs, and it was a very hard time because the artists kept pushing the boundaries forward, and society kept wanting to repress the artwork. It was during this time that I also made some of my own work, video works. And what I'd like to do is read to you a short section of, it's a voiceover from my first video work, which is called Unforgiven Fire. And it was a collaboration with Venus de Mars, and it'll take like 4 minutes. So I'll read this if it's okay. Something just happened. I need to. There, I'm back. Sorry, I don't know what happened. I think Larry fixed it. Anyway, this is the voiceover from Unforgiven Fire. And the visual, we're not going to show this, we're going to show another video later, but the visual on this is I'm seated against a pole, and as I read this, blood is just dripped on my head, and by the end, blood has completely saturated my body. I'm naked in the piece. So here's the voiceover of that. Late night phone calls still frighten me. Years ago, my neighbor Charlie would call in the middle of the night, screaming through his dementia for help, begging us to get him out of the hospital, away from his real and imagined demons. I wouldn't answer the phone. I could only listen to his voice coming through the answering machine. Silent and paralyzed with fear, I thought there was nothing I could do. I never did visit him in that hospital. I was too ashamed, and he never came home again. I remember holding Peter, trying to warm his shivering body, hoping that somehow I could heal him, even for a short while, so he could sleep. Both of us were drenched in his night sweats. He kept apologizing as he cried. I wept too, but my tears were filled with rage. Earlier that day, we had spent hours waiting in line, filling out forms that enabled him to get medications. He had no health insurance, and each stop demanded that he be present to sign the proper forms. So he sat exhausted and consumed by his fevers while I held his place in line. Months later, I dreamt of him and called, only to speak to his daddy. Peter had died that morning in Michael's arms, as his mama urged him to go on. I called my friend Lee at home to see how he was feeling. I just returned from an extended business trip and wanted to reestablish contact. His sister answered the phone, thanked me for calling, and asked if I wanted to share something for those gathered in the apartment for his memorial service. Selfishly, I felt cheated. I wouldn't have any private closure with him. Weeks afterward, I called his disconnected number, hoping we could talk one last time. Months later, I called his phone number again, explaining to the newly connected household how special Lee had been. When the call came ending Kevin's death watch, I was relieved. 3 months prior, the doctors had stopped his feeding up the 3 weeks prior, the doctors had stopped his feeding up the morphine and said he would go in 48 hours. But they didn't know the Kevin I did. We were lovers a decade ago. We trained together, dreamt our dreams together. Upon hearing the news, I thought at least I wouldn't have to call the hospital anymore. His last month with the morphine obliterating all feeling, I would call and be continually told his condition was satisfactory. 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 Most recently, I cried with my friend Margie over the death of her brother Christopher. Margie told me of crawling into Christopher's deathbed to hold him. As his spirit began to leave, instead of releasing, his body contracted as only a dancer could and tightly embraced her. She held on, knowing that he was going, leaving her with the unfinished legacies of all those prematurely lost. He had chosen to die peacefully with great clarity, letting Margie know that his work was now done, but hers and ours only begun. They're all gone now, 96 of my angels. For too many of them, I didn't get to say goodbye. I still need to somehow resolve the forlorn reality of their death. The impact of the grief and the mourning of each new loss remains as intense as the first. Oftentimes, late at night, It is hard for me to breathe as I cry for all the devastation among us. Heroes, all of them so needlessly lost. I'm truly blessed to have been touched by them all, to have been loved by angels. For all of us that have gone before, for those that remain, may there be passionate, unforgiven fire. So, thank you for listening to that. That was the first of 3 films I made around AIDS. My work at the Walker at the same time remained pretty political. In '94, we presented an artist by the name of Ron Athey. And Ron came out of the punk culture, and he did piercing and cutting on stage. And you can imagine the fear of body fluids and blood and issues because it was so feared. But he's a radical artist who's really quite astounding because it's all about transcendence. But I invited the theater and dance critics to come, and they didn't come. So there were no critics, even though they were invited. But 3 weeks after the event, the visual art critic from the main newspaper called me and said, she warned me to look for the story the next day, 3 weeks after the event. She wrote about something she hadn't attended. And I'm going to quote from what she wrote: knife-wielding performer is known to be HIV positive. And the audience knocked over the chairs to get out, away from this. Well, none of it was true. She hadn't seen it. And it started, just as Karen Finley started a lot, this started Senator Jesse Helms, a conservative senator, was all up in arms and was trying to deny funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, and was showing pictures of Ron Athey on the floor, calling him, "This is a cockroach. This is just a cockroach." And I got a lot of hate mail. That this is pre-internet now. So Donald Wildman of the American Family Association is a very conservative religious organization, and they gave out my address and phone number to all his tens of thousands of followers. And the hate mail was pretty astounding of things people hadn't seen. And people were praying for my salvation. They were damning me to hell. They were threatening my life. I got a phone call saying, "We got the abortion doctor, you're next." And sadly, in Wisconsin, an abortion doctor was murdered. And so it was bizarre that people were about something they hadn't seen. My own mother called me up, and cable television show Rush Limbaugh, spent a half hour yelling about the Walker and me and Ron Athey. And he said, I'm quoting it now because I went and found it, "Buckets of AIDS-tainted blood were intentionally thrown at the audience." So when my mom tells me this, I said, "Mom, who are you going to believe? Your son or this clown, Rush Limbaugh?" And she said, "But John, it was on television." And that was cable before Fox News, but Rush Limbaugh was one of the leaders of all this fake news. Anyway, so with that fury, that NEA actually dropped fellowships to individual artists because artists had become so politicized, sadly. The next year was 1996, and they found a tumor inside my spinal cord. And so I had surgery, and it was kind of catastrophic. I woke up paralyzed from the neck down. And so it was a very terrible time. I heard that it's not too bad. You be in the hospital 3 or 4 days and sore neck for a month. The tumor was inside at C2, so it's very high. So those that know me, I walk with a cane, or right now I'm sitting in a wheelchair. But in those first few days, I was completely paralyzed. And it was, yeah, as you can imagine. My husband's in the group with us now, and he really saved my life, which is amazing. But when I remember one morning, some friends were there, and I realized I could move just my little finger. Okay, just that's all I could move. But it was like I felt like I had some control. So when Larry came that day, I said, "Okay, I have something to show you." You're like, "Okay, where do I look?" Because nothing, he wanted not to miss it, but he had to. So I waved hello, and it was profound. But what was interesting about that is that every day in the hospital, you're in a rehab hospital, and some of us have been there. Yeah, would pick me up out of bed, put me in a chair, and then want me to go to occupational therapy, and all I could do is move the one finger, so they just wanted me to move screws around, and stuff. And I said, "Well, no, why don't you bring me into the computer lab?" And so they were like, "Oh, okay." And because I could move the one finger, they would put it by the key, and I would try to type out some words or thoughts. And it was really interesting to spend 23 hours a day in this chaos and realizing you had an opportunity to write something. And what is it you want to write? I didn't have much strength, so I couldn't write a lot. But it was in the chaos, it was a very creative moment for that. As it progressed, movement returned to the right side of my body. And as they were getting me up out of bed and putting me in the wheelchair and then picking me out of the chair, moving, I realized somehow that I could probably, I felt like I could almost stand up. I don't have sensation in my legs, sense of surgery, even today. But I felt like, well, wait a minute, my body can hold itself up somehow. I don't know how, but so I said, I think I can learn to stand up visually. And they're like, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, bring the mirror over." And I said, I was a dancer and we learned in the mirror. And so they were like, "Great, well, okay, we'll try anything. This, it's backwards in the mirror." I said, I know. I used to rehearse with the mirrors. I know it's backwards. So it was incredible. I was able to, they stand me up, there'd be braces on my legs, there'd be a walker, but there'd be the mirror in front of me. And visually I learned, like, okay, this is what it means to stand up in the world now. And I'm so grateful that I'd been a dancer to learn that. And so that little boy dancer in me really helped me there. We had parallel bars. Once I could stand up, I'd be and trying to then move my feet with the mirror and stuff. And so, today I walk visually. And we were, since who's on the call with us today, we walked in Middlebury, and Pam, who's on the call today, we walk in South Burlington. But if we start talking too much, my foot stops because my brain doesn't really know where my foot is. But so I sort of dance through walking, which is really, really lovely. I went from Minneapolis, and Larry and I moved to San Francisco, where I was asked to run a museum, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. And so that was great. It also was, the Bay Area is a great place for disability culture. And I really did need to connect with other artists with disabilities. And so I went down to this disability arts conference, and it was horrible. It was just a horrible experience. I found that the quadriplegics and the paraplegics, there was kind of a hierarchy there, and then those with the power chairs versus those with the manual chairs, the walkers from the canes. And I was like, just like, aren't we a community? You know, are we defining something? Who's worse off or who's better off or who's more able or who's less? It was just, and then also the homophobia was mind-boggling. And, you know, artists were trying to make work and showing work. And it was, I remember this one comic who's quadriplegic. She rolls out of her wheelchair and starts attacking Siegfried and Roy about being such fags in Las Vegas. And it's like, whoa, but the other in the room, this can happen. So anyway, I was really angry about this. And so I went back and with my husband, Larry, we made a film called Crip Shots. And I took the artists that I really loved who had disabilities and who were making really great work. And I thought, okay, we don't want to mainstream into Hollywood. We don't want to be Daniel Day-Lewis winning his Oscar playing someone disabled. We actually want disabled artists who take themselves seriously, who take the art form seriously, and they really work at the technique of it as well with their identity. So we made that, and that was great. And then when I was, Sarah, how are we doing for time?
It's 12:37.
Okay, thank
So
you.
you're halfway.
I then put a book together with a friend called Queer Crips, Disabled Gay Men and Their Stories, because there wasn't really anything like that, but it wasn't inspiration porn. So much disability-related work is about the happy, well-adjusted person that's this is about men who were horny, men who were lonely, people who were depressed, but it was about real life, and it was a great book. We got like 30 turndowns and eventually got published by Hayworth, and it won a Lambda Literary Award. So it was like, yay. So what I want to do now is I asked Sarah if she would screen for us a short video I made in 2003. And it really was, you'll see, it's called Dreaming Awake. It's only 5 minutes. There is nudity in it, but I just want to warn you about that. All of the artists in it are artists with disabilities, but in making the piece, I said, let's not use any of our apparatus, because when you roll into a room, people see the wheelchair. When you walk in with a cane, they see the cane. So these were all dancers who worked in a mixed ability dance company. And so I said, let's try. And so over 6 weeks, we improvised. So Sarah, if you'd show that, please.
I dissociate from the burning in my legs, silently crying between sleep and the morning. Hopes and dreams keep me safe through the night. After surgery, I died then, but you refused and brought me back. 7 years and counting, of tilting toward the ground. I'm afraid if I sit down, I will never get up again. The dancer in me learned to stand visually. The marathoner took the second step. Rehab gave me strength and range of motion, but with each new modality, I interrupt expectations. Improvements are not cures. If I sit down, I will never get up again. Still imagining a body I cannot have, I startle myself, glimpsing fatigue in passing windows. My bifurcated body torques with every stride. Neuropathy and weariness debilitates. Therapists caution about wear and tear, while friends cheer, You're getting better. If I sit down, I will never get up again. Navigating deadened limbs and twisted trunk, pain remains constant, dulling our life together. After a day's activities, I have no comfort left to give you. Living through chemistry, libido is gone. Holding and touching you, I long for remembered sensations. I'm afraid if I sit down, I'll never get up again. If I sit down, I'll never get up again. Metaphorical body, I try to intercept suffering, abide in discomfort, forgive the trauma. Bearing witness, I sit with loss, move towards unobstructed feeling, and bring you along into my dreaming awake.
Okay, Sarah, thank you. So that was 2003. I did a project that Vermont PBS is still showing called Holding On. It's profiles of three couples grappling with disability, with one person getting disabled midlife. And that's still screened. I did a concert video of a singer I love named Janice Ian. And then most recently, I did a project with a choreographer named Eiko Otake. And you can see those on Vermont PBS, or you can go to Vimeo and type in John R. Killacky, and there's about 9 of my films. You can see that they're open to the public. You know, I was at the Flynn, but for the last 4 years, Sarah said I've been a legislator, and it's been interesting if I think about the artist side of me, you know, in the legislature, because as a dancer, I learned sometimes you're a soloist, sometimes you're a member of the ensemble, you know, and group improvisation is always better than solo improvisation. And those tools came in handy as we went through bills. The other thing is in these films, you storyboard them ahead of time and then you shoot them. and then in the editing process, you almost have to throw out your storyboard because you have to work with the materials you have. You can't be stuck with, oh, we missed that shot, because you don't get to do it over again. And it's the same thing as bills go through the iterative process. You can start here, but by the time it goes through the committee, to testimony, to the floor of the House, to the Senate, back to the Senate, to the governors, there's 7 or 8 iterations, and you cannot be stuck with the storyboard of the bill. And so I felt like sometimes my art background was really helpful in those situations. I've always led this hybrid life of being an artist and an administrator, but early on I thought I needed to bifurcate it somehow. Like if I would be less seriously considered as an artist, people knew I was an administrator, or vice versa, right? You know, so it was fascinating. But one time the Harvard Film Archives was showing one of my works, and afterwards I was still at the Walker Art Center at that time. Afterwards, someone raised their hand and said, "Do you ever get confused with that guy with the same name at the Walker?" And I thought, oh, this is just silly that I think I need to have 2 different personalities or personas. And so, you know, I just kind of integrated it. I think the last thing is I was thinking about this because I know some of you, and the ones I know are artists. And, you know, as artists, it's really interesting whenever we start a new project, the insecurities, you know, explode and the confidence implodes, you know. And I made 16 films. I'm starting to work on a new film on Fluxus. And my censor keeps saying, will anyone be interested in this? And it's sort of like, well, that can't stop me from doing this. And the AIDS films, the disability films, I didn't make it for anyone to be interested in them. But what's interesting, I've learned, is that artists have 2 jobs. You make work, and then you really have to put it in the world for it to find its meaning. And so I think with that, and or we can talk about my insecurities more if you want. But, I thought I'd open it up for questions. I appreciate everyone's patience. So, Sarah, do you want to just, how do you handle questions here? People raise their hands, or I think we're such a small group, people can just talk.
Yeah, that's usually how it goes. So
Okay.
Question or comment.
I'll jump in with a question. First, John, thank you so much for your talk today. I didn't realize you would cover so much ground about your life. It was really powerful and insightful, and I could really relate to a bunch of things. One, the piece about body and bifurcation, having been through some experiences related to physical challenges. And then also, I wanted to ask a question, well, comment and make a question, have a question about your approach to having art be a livelihood in combination with having it be a way of making political statements. I know several artists within our collective who use their art as a vehicle for making political statements, whether it be statements about their own, you know, sufferings and challenges vis-a-vis mental illness, or kind of in another realm. One artist who apologizes for not being here today and would have loved your talk. She uses her art, you know, in large part to comment on the climate crisis, and in particular, the fight against plastics. And her comment almost every show to me is that people want to buy art that's pretty. They don't want to buy art that's a comment on climate change. And it's hard for someone who focuses all of their time, or wants to focus all of their career time, all of their livelihood effort on art when it's not as marketable. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, maybe advice about that, for people who are, very dedicated to their craft and dedicated to making a statement.
Well, Carrie, I spent my entire life working on behalf of artists, and sadly, America does not value artists, and so very few of the dancers who were spectacular, creative geniuses were able to get careers. Even painters back in the 60s and 70s were not able to maintain a career. And those that do create a brand, and it's more mainstreamed and accessible, as you talked about that one artist. I've been blessed in that, I have this hybrid life where I usually have had a day job, and I make small projects. My films, only one cost a lot. It was a concert documentary, Genesee, and the others, I am able to cobble together financing of $5,000 to $10,000 for them, usually through grants. I don't really make any money on my art. The book that I mentioned, Because Art, was I self-published it last year, and it was through Phoenix Books, the Onion River Press, and a year later, it still hasn't broken even, and it's gotten really lovely reviews, and it's sold well. So I persist making my work in the world because it is affirming to me. I also hold on to the people I've lost in my life through the art, and I have found that the more myopic a piece it is, the more personal it is, the more resonant it becomes. And like Eiko Otake and I in 2019 did a piece called Elegies, and it's from on PBS, and it really was just sort of a goodbye letter to each of our mothers. And we made it's very simple. We made it with Vermont PBS. It's 9 minutes long. And people kept saying, well, who is this for? And it's like, well, first it's for us. But then then the second job of an artist is to put it in the world. And I found that, of course, everyone has a mother, and everyone loses a parent or a grandparent or a dear one. And what's really important is that what Eiko and I thought we were making became something different when people saw it. So we made it in 2019. When it aired on PBS, it was the pandemic, and people couldn't go to the homes to see their mothers. So people were telling us that it meant so much to them that there could be a kind of a resolving elegy about the loss of a parent. We also were invited to Minneapolis to show it, and it happened to be the very week that George Floyd was murdered. And George Floyd's last words were calling out for his mother. So what was interesting there is that the piece meant something different in Minneapolis than it meant when we were making it in our studios. And so I went very far from your question, but I've never made any money of my art. So I would not know how to tell you. Robert, maybe he can talk about, when he's talking with us next month, he can talk about how you build a market for his beautiful art, And
my brother is Susanna, my brother, not my brother, but my sister-in-law's brother made it in the art field back in the 80s, 90s. He spent a lot of years. He went to University of Philadelphia, whatever it is, the Pennsylvania, the art school down in Pennsylvania. And he spent many years painting, and he broke through the market finally sometime in the late 80s. He paints like Wyeth, and Jamie Wyeth purchased one of his paintings, and he was selling his commission. He was doing commissions for 40 to 60,000 on average. Then he had a fallout with his wife because he was unfortunately going with some other people, and they divorced, and his art plummeted. But he's been building it back up again, and he teaches classes as well. So there's an instance where somebody has made it. That's in the state of Maine. My grandfather on the other side of the family, on my father's side, my mother was an artist and illustrated children's books, and my grandfather on the other side of the family, my father's, and I, for me, it's like not my, if I was to do a film, I wouldn't do it about my mother, I'd do it about my father, but that's, I think that's that crossover. Yeah, anyway, my grandfather probably would have made a fair amount of money but he couldn't sell his artwork. He would have commissions, and when it was time to sell the piece of art, he'd either give it away because he felt like he was selling himself, or he'd reduce the commission drastically.
Thanks, Susanna. Thank you. You have an unbelievable family of artists. I've heard some of your stories. It's really impressive. I just wondered, do you have a question for John? Time is just getting kind of short.
Right, I don't, because I missed most of it trying to get on.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for chiming in. Does anyone else have any questions in the last few minutes for John?
I do. John, so much of what you talk about seems to be, in a beautiful, beautiful way, a pushback against, you used the word branding before, that idea of life having to be a perfect picture. And I really appreciate that in your work, because it's this quest for perfecting, noticing, but not towards perfection. And I wondered if you could say something about that, if there is some of that in your mind, or if I'm just seeing that.
Well, it was, since it was fun putting the book together, because it was, I've been very blessed. I've published like over 300 pieces, and trying to put something together, I chose 56 of them. But I got to look at stuff, and as a writer, I just keep writing, and I don't think about anything but the next project. And when that project's done, I panic and think, what's the next thing? And so I just keep writing. And some of the things were of its moment that didn't resonate 30 years later, and some things weren't good. And so going back to see them, it was like, okay, this is a kind of a fun project to cull these things and to, put them together to make sense. But I still had the same panic. Last week I published something in 7 days, and it's like, oh my God, now what am I going to do? If I don't, what will I have a next idea? But I think the whole thing is you just keep making the next thing happen. And it's about the process of making work. And then whether it's my own history or the world will decide if anything is good or not. That's almost not my job. I can do the best I can.
So John, I don't think I was very clear, but I love what you said because that's so important about the process. But what I'm trying to say is everything you write, every video I've seen of yours seems to celebrate the process of living versus having this perfect image and picture of living. And I just want you to know how much I appreciate that, because that is what life is. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, it's 1 o'clock now, so Anyone else has any questions they want to get in, feel free to email them to me if you don't already know John directly.
And vote for Robert on the daisies. Those 3 categories. Next month, we're going to be celebrating him. All right. It was really fun to be with you all today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, John. Thanks for being with us.
Is there
Okay.
anyone you want to point us to see or purchase your work before we go?
Well, Phoenix Books has my book called Because Art, or you can get it on Amazon too, but it's nice it's in Phoenix. So a local bookstore.
Cool.
Anyway.
Thank you so much, John.
All right. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
See y'all.
Thanks.